and what now I think has to reasonably be described as the worst transaction in football history.
He's a $73 million cap hit next year and the year after. The worst quarterback in the NFL right now. Dead last in practically everything.
At the very start of the season, I made a promise to myself to only make 1 to 2 videos on how terrible Deshaun Watson is per month. And so far, we've held true to that promise, because as time goes on, we have more and more evidence that Deshaun Watson is truly a shell of his former self and a horrific QB. And on top of that, he's holding the Cleveland Browns hostage, and there's nothing they could do about it. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. Before we get to the content, we are on the grind to 1 million subscribers. Make sure you subscribe and turn on our notifications to help us get to that goal. Now that we get all that out of the way, work! We made $500 on Prize Picks this past Sunday, and fortunately, a lot of you guys tailed my picks on Instagram and Snapchat, and you guys let me know in my DMs. One of you even made $1,000 from my picks. Prize Picks is giving us another free square, meaning we only need to get 1 pick correct in order to 3x our money. All Anthony Edwards needs to do on opening night is score 1 point. Fortunately, we've been on a crazy streak, and if you haven't played Prize Picks, download the app or click on the link in the description down below and use my promo code Mikerophone to get $100 when you make an entry of $5 or more. Then follow me on Instagram at @TheFlightMike or on Snapchat to get my picks for free. And thank you, Prize Picks, for the sponsor. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? For the fans that are wondering where's the video on the Dallas Cowboys, I'm gonna bring that to you guys a little later because they're on a bye. The story of Deshaun Watson is very near and dear to my heart, primarily because he was one of my favorite players in the NFL when he was playing for the Houston Texans. And look, man, I'm not ashamed of admitting that. When I watched him play in Clemson and become a national champion in 2016, I was immediately addicted to his game. He had literally everything you would want in a quarterback. He had athleticism, size, speed, and a tremendous football IQ. And it was this football IQ that got him drafted with the 12th overall pick in the 2017 NFL draft by the Houston Texans. Before getting drafted to the NFL, Dabo Swinney called Deshaun Watson the Michael Jordan of football, and in his rookie season, he backed up those claims. In only 6 games starting for the Houston Texans, Deshaun Watson had a 62% completion percentage, threw for 1,700 passing yards, 19 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions. And this was only in 6 games starting. He was also able to add an additional 2 touchdowns on the ground, and that was just a glimpse of this young man's potential. In 2018, he picked up where he left off, throwing for over 4,000 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. He also added 551 yards rushing and 5 TDs on the ground, but he was also sacked a league-high 62 times. But back then, the Houston Texans actually showed some signs of competence, and immediately they decided to trade for some help for Deshaun Watson, trading a huge haul, 2 first-round picks and a second-round pick to the Miami Dolphins in return for Laramie Tunsil, Kenny Stills, a 4th-round pick, and a 6th-round pick. Was it a little aggressive? Yes, but whenever you have a star quarterback that was just sacked 62 times, I could understand the urgency in trading that haul for a blindside anchor. And ultimately it paid off. Deshaun Watson had another incredible season in year 3, completing 67% of his passes, 3,852 passing yards, 26 touchdowns and 12 interceptions, 7 additional rushing TDs, and instead of getting sacked 62 times, he was sacked 44 times. And unfortunately, this will be the last bit of success that Deshaun Watson would taste with the Houston Texans, because despite having one of the most exciting young teams in the NFL, with JJ Watt and Jadeveon Clowney on the defensive side of the ball, and Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins on the offensive side of the ball, the Houston Texans decided to screw all of that up in 2020, trading DeAndre Hopkins to the Arizona Cardinals for a trade package centered around David Johnson. The thing that was even more head-scratching is they made a separate trade for Brandon Cooks shortly after, so everybody was expecting Deshaun Watson to have a horrific season in 2020. And the most surprising part of all is the exact opposite would happen. In 2020, Deshaun Watson would give us his single best statistical output of his career, throwing for over 4,800 passing yards, 33 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. He would get sacked 49 times, but he would also add 3 rushing TDs. He completed 70% of his passes, and the Texans would go 4-12. JJ Watt would famously say this to Deshaun Watson following the season.
Good job, brother. I'm sorry. We wasted one of your years. I'm sorry. You should have 11 wins.
And shortly after, Deshaun Watson would demand a trade from the Houston Texans, primarily because he didn't like the Jack Easterby ran Houston Texans. They weren't making good decisions, they weren't making good moves, and shortly after, things would get even worse for Deshaun Watson. We all know what would happen from here on out. Multiple allegations would be filed against Deshaun Watson in regards to his affinity for massages. It got so bad that Deshaun Watson had to take off for the 2021 season. On top of losing multiple endorsement deals with Nike and Beats by Dre, Reliant Energy, and HEB, and Deshaun Watson's football future was up in the air. Now, it wouldn't be until March of 2022 where a grand jury declined to indict Watson on criminal charges related to the incidents, but he still faced 22 civil lawsuits, which would get settled in August, but until then, NFL teams realized that Deshaun Watson would be available for a trade. Now, here's where things would get very interesting, because Deshaun Watson would do a grand tour of multiple teams that he'd be interested in. The primary contenders for Deshaun Watson's services were the New Orleans Saints, Atlanta Falcons, and Carolina Panthers. The Cleveland Browns also planned a visit with Deshaun Watson as well, but Deshaun Watson wasn't very interested in them. From Cleveland's point of view, they were coming off of a very interesting season. You see, up until this point, Baker Mayfield has been their best quarterback in franchise history. But the problem with Baker is he'd give you a really good season and then follow that up with a poor season. But his poor seasons were rationalized. For instance, in year 1, Baker Mayfield completed 64% of his passes, 27 touchdowns to 14 interceptions, and led the Browns to 6 wins out of the 13 games he played. So the Browns decided to build around Baker Mayfield even further, trading for a star wide receiver in Odell Beckham Jr., bringing in Olivier Vernon, and also allowing Baker Mayfield to have a say in regards to who his next head coach should be. Baker chooses Freddie Kitchens, and Freddie Kitchens was the wrong guy. Baker regressed mightily. The offense had no rhythm at all whatsoever, and Baker threw for 22 touchdowns to 21 interceptions while leading the Browns to a 6-10 record in his second year. So the Browns get rid of Freddie Kitchens and hire Kevin Stefanski, who placed a greater emphasis on the run game. The Browns utilized Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb a little bit more, and Baker Mayfield had his best season to date for the Browns in terms of overall team success, leading them to 11 wins, throwing for 3,500 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions, and even defeated his division rival Pittsburgh Steelers in the playoffs before inevitably losing the very next game. Now, at that point, fans were just saying that Baker was a product of a good defense, and that's not necessarily wrong. Baker definitely utilized a successful rushing attack and one of the most potent defenses in the NFL to lead the Browns to wins. But at the same time, I always felt like that's a ridiculous argument. Would Patrick Mahomes win the Super Bowl over the past 2 years if it wasn't for his defense? I mean, literally the play that won the Chiefs the Super Bowl last year was Chris Jones pressuring Brock Purdy to seal the game. But ultimately, going into year 4, Cleveland had to make a decision on Baker Mayfield. Were they going to exercise his 5th-year option, or were they going to let him walk in free agency? Well, year 4 was a catastrophe for the Cleveland Browns. Baker Mayfield injured his shoulder multiple times throughout the season, and in typical Baker Mayfield fashion, he opted to play through the injury. As a result, the Browns thought that this was how Baker Mayfield is. He'll give you one good season and follow it up with a bad season, and they just thought he sucked. And to be honest, for that season, Baker did stink, but he was playing through an injury. The Browns went 6-8 with Baker under center. He threw 17 touchdowns to 13 interceptions and completed 60.5% of his passes. So the Browns felt like if they moved on from Baker Mayfield and they traded for Deshaun Watson, then they would have all the pieces that were necessary necessary to win a Super Bowl. In theory, it wasn't the wrong philosophy, because once again, Deshaun Watson was coming off of a spectacular season for the Houston Texans, although he was a year removed from football. But the problem was the way the Browns got Deshaun Watson. You see, it's not like the Browns went up to Deshaun Watson and said,
"Hey, come play for us and you'll probably win a Super Bowl."
Because Deshaun Watson straight up rejected the Browns the first time he was approached by them. It wasn't until the Browns made Watson an offer that he couldn't refuse that he agreed to be traded to the Cleveland Browns. So on March 18th, 2022, the Cleveland Browns sent a first and fourth round pick in 2022, a first and third round pick in 2023, and a first and fourth round pick in 2024 in return for Deshaun Watson. What's even crazier than this is, on top of deciding to trade for Deshaun Watson, they decided to renegotiate his existing contract. On September 5th, 2020, Deshaun Watson signed a 4-year, $177.5 million contract extension with $111 million guaranteed with the Houston Texans. At the time, it was the second most lucrative contract in the NFL, just after Aaron Rodgers. But the Browns decided to renegotiate his contract, signing Deshaun Watson to an unprecedented 5-year, $230 million contract, making it the largest contract with the most guaranteed money in NFL history. Since then, other quarterbacks have asked for this contract, and pretty much every other team that had to deal with a QB negotiating for such a contract responded by saying,
"We're not as incompetent as the Cleveland Browns."
So the Browns unfortunately were against the clock, because Deshaun Watson's cap hit versus the Cleveland Browns was going to be very hefty following his third year. Unfortunately, year one of Deshaun Watson on the Cleveland Browns wasn't necessarily the greatest. Deshaun Watson would get suspended for the first 11 games of the 2022 regular season, and by the time he returned, he looked nothing like the version of himself that played in Cleveland, despite having a fairly solid supporting cast. Deshaun Watson completed 58% of his passes for over 1,100 passing yards, 7 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, and led the Browns to a 3-3 record, which wasn't good enough to make it to the playoffs, but at the time, Browns fans were saying, hey, maybe Deshaun Watson's rusty, which I didn't really think was that legitimate of an argument. So in 2023, fans were excited to see if they would get the old Deshaun Watson from Houston back. And to be honest, not really. Deshaun would lead the Browns to a 5-1 record, but they weren't necessarily winning games because of him. It was primarily the defense, and Deshaun Watson was just doing his absolute best not to throw away the game. He threw for 7 touchdowns to 4 interceptions and over 1,100 passing yards once again before fracturing his right shoulder. Watson would undergo season-ending injury to repair a broken bone in his throwing shoulder, and by year 3, Deshaun Watson's cap hit was starting to come into effect. But despite this, the Browns still made sizable upgrades around Watson. If you take a look at Deshaun Watson's team, apart from his offensive line, it's not that bad of a team. At wide receiver, he has Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy, and Elijah Moore. At tight end, he has David Njoku, who is a former first-round pick. His defense is one of the best defenses in the NFL, and of course, he doesn't have Nick Chubb this year, but Jerome Ford and Deontay Foreman are a solid rushing duo, although not one of the greatest in the NFL, primarily because their quarterback hasn't been much of a threat so far. So how would year 3 of the Deshaun Watson experience go? Well, fairly terribly. And I guess this is why I waited so long to discuss how terrible Deshaun Watson has been so far, because Austin Gale gave us some meme-worthy stats. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard some of these. Over the past 3 weeks, Deshaun Watson has as many touchdowns as Rodney McLeod Jr., which is the safety of the Cleveland Browns. Watson has also taken a league-high 31 sacks, which is 11 more than any other QB in the league. He's been sacked on 13.5% of his dropbacks, which is tied for the 10th highest rate for a quarterback in weeks 1 through 6 since at least 2000. Now, of course, the Browns have been beat up at the offensive line this year. Jack Conklin and Jedrick Wills haven't been available, but he currently has the 4th highest pressure to sack ratio and the 5th highest time to throw on all dropbacks, meaning that a lot of this is also on Deshaun Watson. I'm sure you guys have heard this statistic as well. The Browns are currently 0 for 26 on their last 26 third downs with Deshaun Watson under center, according to the Fox broadcast. Watson's dropback percentage on third downs this season is 24%, which is the 11th lowest success rate on third downs for any QB in weeks 1 through 6. Of course, Browns fans remember Joe Flacco at the end of last season, as he was able to lead them to the playoffs before obviously having a meltdown in the playoffs. But Joe Flacco in 2024, in 2.5 games, games, 7 TDs and 1 interception. Deshaun Watson in 2024 in 6 games, 5 TDs and 3 interceptions. In terms of net yards per attempt, which subtracts sack yards lost from passing yards and divides the difference by dropbacks, Deshaun Watson has the 5th lowest net yards per attempt average, which is 4.2 in weeks 1 through 6 since 2000, placing him in the bottom 1% of all QBs. Notably, New England's Jacoby Brissett is at 4.4 net yards per attempt this season, and that's still better than Watson, and Brissett's already been benched. Bill Barnwell discusses how horrible Deshaun Watson has been in terms of moving the chains. Since 2007, 566 quarterbacks have thrown at least 100 passes in the first 6 games of their team's respective seasons. By first downs per pass attempt, Bo Nix's 2024 season is tied for 564th, which is 22.2%, and Deshaun Watson's 2024 season is 566th, which is 22.1%. To quantify how horrible Deshaun Watson has been, here's how quarterbacks perform in expected passing situations through week 6. And at the very bottom behind Bo Nix and Gardner Minshew is Deshaun Watson, who is only ahead of Will Levis, Jacoby Brissett, and Bryce Young. 2 of those 3 quarterbacks have already been benched, but not Deshaun Watson. You might be wondering why, and we're gonna get to why in just a sec. Austin Gale continues to mention that the Cleveland Browns' offensive success rate in weeks 1 to 3 is the lowest it's ever been in any season for the franchise since 2000. And bear in mind, this is the Cleveland Browns that have historically had bad offenses, and Deshaun Watson is leading an all-time franchise bad for one of the worst franchises in the NFL. And currently, he still is. The Browns' offense is averaging negative 1.3 EPA per drive, which is the lowest average for any Browns offense in weeks 1 through 6 since at least 2000. It's also the worst Browns offense this millennium by success rate and yards per play. Watson also ranks last in EPA per dropback and success rate among any Browns quarterback, with 120 plus dropbacks in weeks 1 through 6 since at least 2000. Let's step away from EPA and let's just discuss QBR for a second. Austin Gale goes into it again. He's currently dead last by ESPN's QBR metric, which scales quarterback performance from 0 to 100 at 21.5. For comparison, he had a QBR of 43.7 last season before he was injured, and his career high QBR was as a rookie in Houston at 83.7. To put his QBR into context, he's currently worse than Blaine Gabbert's 22.2 in 2011 and is the worst since Carolina's Jimmy Clausen, who posted a QBR of 13.8 in 2010. Now, for those of you guys that don't understand EPA per dropback, just take a look at this chart. Deshaun Watson has the same EPA as Kyle Buller and is only slightly above David Carr, Jay Fielder, Andrew Walter, Will Levis, Joey Harrington, Cordell Stewart, Josh Rosen, and Jamarcus Russell. When we discuss success rate on dropbacks, Deshaun Watson is only beating out David Carr, Mark Bulger, Josh Rosen, Achilles Smith, Jay Fielder, Blaine Gabbert, and Jamarcus Russell. And the final icing on the cake in this incredible article by Austin Gale is this argument that he is worse than Jamarcus Russell. Deshaun Watson has generated a negative 66.2 EPA on dropbacks, beating Russell's negative 62.8 EPA on dropbacks in weeks 1 through 6 in 2009 for the record low this millennium. Now, here's the craziest part. Deshaun Watson has so much leverage over the Cleveland Browns that there's literally nothing that you could do here. I mean, last week, a reporter asked Deshaun Watson that if Ken Dorsey brought in all of this new stuff, a brand new offense, shouldn't he be the one that's calling the plays? And look at how Deshaun Watson throws his coach under the bus.
Sean, if Dorsey brought all this new stuff in, should he be the one calling the plays?
That's a Kevin question.
If you just take a look at the eye test, whether it's his lowlights versus the Commanders or Bobby Wagner literally trolling him to his face, or maybe I need to show you more statistics, like the fact that an astounding 45% of passes directed at Amari Cooper have qualified as off target this season. We haven't seen an off target rate that high for a player with 40 plus targets since at least a year prior in 2011. Now, don't get me wrong, there are instances where Deshaun Watson's wide receivers drop the pass as well, but the craziest part is whenever Watson is asked about this, he doesn't even acknowledge the fact that he's playing terribly.
It's getting pretty loud, national guys criticizing you. So how do you go about continuing to block that out?
I just continue to. First off, I don't hear it, I don't see it. So I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on any social media or things like that. So anytime that stuff comes up, the only time I first hear it is either you guys are bringing it up or somebody else outside, and I just don't know who it's coming from. So,
which brings us to one question: why hasn't Deshaun Watson been benched up until this point? His name is being thrown up there with the likes of Will Levis and David Carr and Kyle Bowler and Jamarcus Russell, for crying out loud. How is it that he still has a job? Well, it's pretty simple. The Browns don't really have a choice. This is what happens whenever you give up this many assets for a quarterback and pay him fully guaranteed money. Look, the Denver Broncos trade for Russell Wilson is without a doubt one of the worst trades in NFL history, and no one is discounting that. They gave up multiple assets, multiple first-round picks, and then extended Russell Wilson and cut him before he even played a single down on that extension. There's no question that it's one of the worst trades in NFL history. The difference between the Broncos trade for Russell Wilson and the Browns trade for Deshaun Watson is that the Browns gave Deshaun Watson fully guaranteed money. So when Kevin Stefanski is asked each and every week why he's not going to try Jameis Winston at the quarterback position, all he can say is, I think Deshaun Watson gives us the best chance to win, and he continues to give us the best chance to win, and we need to play really good football at his position and at every position to be successful. But the truth is that the Browns don't have a choice. I mean, Ari Meirov says it perfectly here. The Browns can't say this, and they won't say this, but there's nothing they can do about Deshaun Watson. He's making $45 million this year, will make $45 million fully guaranteed next year, and another $45 million fully guaranteed the year after that, with cap hits of $72.9 million in both years. You can't bench that. They'll have to word salad their way through this until he plays well and they actually start winning. But the thing is, if you ask some players, or if you ask Shannon Sharp, they'll say that Deshaun Watson lost his confidence. But if you ask me, I don't think Deshaun Watson lost his confidence. I think he lost his will to win. I mean, there is no will to win. Why would you go out and try if you're getting paid no matter what? You don't just magically start stinking whenever you used to play like this. Think about it. Yeah, Deshaun was away from football for a season. That's fine. But you don't just magically forget how to play the game of football at your position. You don't go from a quarterback that had over 4,800 passing yards and completed 70% of his passes, 33 touchdowns to 7 interceptions with Brandon Cooks as your top wide receiver, to a quarterback that's missing Amari Cooper 45% of the time out of nowhere. It's just sad because Deshaun Watson was one of my favorite players in the NFL before the allegations, and it's just really sad to see him go out like this, both off of the field and on the field. And I'm gonna be honest, this isn't gonna be our only Deshaun Watson video this year, because I'm sure it's just gonna get worse and worse. But if you're a Browns fan, let me know in the comment section down below, how do you guys feel about all this? I apologize if this is longer than our average video. This is just a topic I'm very passionate about and know a decent amount of history on. We also have a video on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are probably as big of a dumpster fire as the Cleveland Browns, although there is a light at the end of the tunnel to fix them. I'll leave a link to that in the end screen. I'll meet you guys there. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.